participate in this very important discourse. For introductory purposes, my name is William Kiema. I am based out of Nairobi, Kenya. I teach air and space law, and I'm also an author in that space. I've authored two books. One which is Space Law and Policy in Africa. That was actually the second book, but the first book was on aviation law. And my interest on both areas arose from my PhD study at the University of Cape Town. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Williams. Do you want to talk broadly about the topic first? Your perspective around like Pan-Africanism, right, before we go into the conversation?
Yeah, so I do have a presentation that I will
Oh, yes,
actually want to.
absolutely.
Yes,
Yes, feel free. You should be able to share. Can you try sharing your screen?
yes, I am able to share. Let me speak presentation, but I can allow my colleague to introduce himself so that I can now go to the
Okay,
presentation. Yes, if you allow me.
absolutely. Thando, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Thando Mathe and I'm based in Zimbabwe at the moment, but I mostly work from Switzerland in Geneva. I work for the United Nations Institute of Disarmament Research under their space security program. Outside of that, I'm an optimist for the African space program and all space activities in Africa. And I think most of you would know me probably from LinkedIn, and my tagline is always Africa is going to space. And it's I mean we'll talk more about it, but it's something that we have to embody optimistically if we are going to enjoy ourselves and follow the development of space in Africa. Outside of that, my background is in geographic information systems and Earth observation, and now I'm in space policy. I've worked with government, private sector, and the non-governmental sectors alike. So I look forward to an interesting conversation. It's always fun conversations here on this webinar. So looking forward to fun again today. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you. Thanks, Thando, for introducing yourself. Dr. Williams, is it good you end with the screen share? You're on mute, so we can
Yeah,
yeah.
my apologies for that.
No, no worries. No worries.
Thank you so much, Thando. I am a huge fan of the work that you're doing, and I do follow you on LinkedIn, and you are quite in an enviable institution and doing quite an amazing work. So it's such a great pleasure to share a platform with you. I think that has helped raise my profile this morning in Nairobi. Yeah, so
Oh no.
yeah, so but I'm very passionate, as I mentioned, uh, about the African continent. Of course, being an African myself, but also I've taken a keen interest on African integration throughout my career and academic research and practice and consultancy. I think my focus actually has been on the great work or looking at the needs for the African continent. And part of the reason why I got a motivation to write on the African continent, because my two books are actually on two initiatives of the African Union and how these two initiatives contribute, or how these two initiatives have actually shaped the African continent, as it were. And that interest was actually aroused during my master's study when I did a master's in international trade law, also focusing on the African continent integration. And therefore, I published quite a lot in both area of more specifically in the area of air law, which is aviation, focusing on all this telling African stories, because I believe that there has not been sufficient African or enough African storytellers to tell our own story. And who tells the story really matters in terms of how they shape information. Information is actually power. And on this side of the continent, unfortunately, we don't have many people telling the African. So even in this space of space law in Africa, a lot has actually been written from other part of the world by authors from different parts of the world. And it all depends with the specs that people wear, and that can actually inform a lot of. I'm not saying that all of them have biases, but it's also quite important to have African telling their own African stories. And I think both topics in terms of Pan-Africanism and space law, they're actually tied to the IP, and it's actually quite important for us to really appreciate the history of Pan-Africanism and even the linkages between Pan-Africanism and space law. And at the risk of sounding too trite, I think it's good to appreciate what Pan-Africanism is, which is basically the movement or political ideology that is to bring about solidarity and unity among people of African descent, both on the African continent and in the diaspora. And quite the entire ideology of Pan-Africanism is actually stands on the shared history, commitment, and problem that African continent has actually experienced over a period of time. And it is actually premised on the fact that, or on the belief, rather, that Africans on the continent and in the diaspora share a common origin. They have endured the same challenges, and they also have the same destiny in terms of political, economic, and such. And therefore, in terms of understanding Pan-Africanism, its origin is particularly important to understand. Most of the discussions, of course, taking place in late 18th century, late 20th century, 19th and early 20th century rather, and most of these discussions actually happening, being shaped from the diaspora community in the Caribbean, in the United States, and also in European circles, and all that informing, of course, rising from those common challenges that we've mentioned: colonialism, slavery, and exploitation, transatlantic slavery, and which the major player or the major origin was actually the African continent. And we look at a lot of those discussions, of course, that are happening in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They shape a lot of similar discussions when we enter into 60s, when most of the African countries are actually getting independence. And that leads to part of the reason. First of all, I should have started by wishing us Happy Africa Day, which we marked on 25th. And basically, that day we mark to celebrate the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which was the predecessor to now the African Union. But even before the formation of African Unity in 1963, there are key discussions happening in 1959, 60, 61, 62 about now that, looking into now that African countries are going to get independent. And with Ghana, of course, attaining independence in 57, there is a lot of discussions in terms of what is the best way that the African continent can actually really come together. And of course, all those discussions are actually shaped by the Pan-Africanism ideology that is really taking shape, not only just in the continent, but also outside the continent. And that leads to a lot of discussions. And perhaps you might have heard what we call the Casablanca Group, led by the likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Muammar Gaddafi, Ahmed Nasser, that advocated for a total unification or radical unification of the African continent and fashioned it in the manner of the United States of Africa. And then that was then the other group, which is the Monrovia group, that is was led by Leonard Sego of what's the name of what is the name of this country that is eating the news that I'm actually forgetting right now? Senegal, sorry, Senegal, and a lot of discussions, of course, Nigeria, that is as well as contributing quite a lot in terms of the Monrovia group, which is actually at that time in 1960s advocating for a gradual approach towards integration. And at the end of the day, the Monrovia group actually carries the day, and that actually sheds a lot of the formation and the ideology behind the African unity, which was more of a political organization really to help or facilitate or read the treaty establishing the Organization of African Unity, which actually came into force, which actually established the OAU in 1963, 25th of the month, which is actually part of the reason, the main reason actually why we celebrate Africa Day, was actually to really bring African countries, but not necessarily for economic development, but to deal with political challenges, with the major political challenge at this time being independence, trying to liberalize, to liberate rather the African continent. And that actually subsequently in 1960s, 70s, the OAU is very effective. So the idea of Pan-Africanism is that at this time is dealing the political and racial issues in Southern Africa, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa with the apartheid regime. And now post-1980s, when most African countries have actually become politically independent, now there is need to have a shift of this conversation now to economic. And that we start having the conversation of 1980, the Lagos Plan of Action, and 1991 Abuja Treaty, which actually now bring in more economic. And that leads to an entire, not an entire overhaul, but I would say 70% overhaul that culminated in in the year 2002 in the establishment of African Union. And therefore, when you look at all that historical evolution, it has really shaped how the key aspect in terms of when we look at the concept of Pan-Africanism. And when we go now back to how we define Pan-Africanism, which is basically the looking at our ties as African continent, as inhabitants, and also diaspora, of course, looking at our ties and looking at how do we look at solutions for our own problems. Because increasingly the story that we have narrated, or that historical antecedent, really explains so many factors and has a lot of influences in terms of a lot of interest when we see in terms of when we look at other continents or colonial activities and foreign activities. Of course, they will always have an agenda when you look at instruments. And I think I've done quite a lot of instruments like trade liberalization instrument. When you look at most of the programs in 1980s, like structural adjustment programs, really over a period of time, it has come to the realization that African continent needs to rise on itself, and we need to have African solutions to African problems. And therefore, I see that is really the embodiment or the epitome of what Pan-Africanism is actually entailed. And therefore, when you look at these key discussions from now, because we were talking about Agenda 2063, which is Agenda 2063, of course, is a discussion that starts again in 1963, 50 years coming to 2013, which we marked 50 years. And then after 50 years, we sat as an African continent and stakeholders to be able to do a self-introspection in terms of evaluating the models of economic development, what has actually contributed to that, to the state of things that we are at. And therefore, through the mechanism or within the auspices of African Union, now we sat down together and projected for another 50-year plan from 2013 to 2063. When we have actually identified a number of sectors or key initiatives, better actually initiatives that can actually propel us to 2063. And these initiatives are made to solve African problems through or to use African solutions to African problem. And one of those items or agenda, or one of these instruments or projects that have actually been identified for that propelling or catalyzing us to that future is space law. And I know my time is so much gone, but just allow me now to just link that discussion and even what I argue in my book in terms of space law being a tool and actually a quite important tool for the purposes of propelling us to the future. First of all, again, at the danger of sounding trite, I would assume that we all know the benefit of space law, not space law, but space sector in terms of the economy, agriculture, telecommunication, banking. Basically, space as space technologies have infiltrated every aspect of our lives, and increasingly space sector is becoming congested and also contested in so many spheres, and therefore the recognition of space law as a major contribution or as a major tool to propel us to 2063 in a manner that is sustainable has actually been informed by those benefits. But also when you look at this conversation in terms of how are we faring as African continent in terms of space, and how are we faring in terms of looking at ourselves, how are we looking at the concept of solidarity, how are we utilizing our bonds? Because remember, we defined Pan-Africanism as looking at our ties, our bond, inward looking, that collective coming together to really solve into this problem. And when you, I think, part of reflecting on the history, it really shows that the African continent has not really fared well in, I would say, virtually all sectors. When you look, for instance, at trade, we still trade the least. We have very low level of intra-African trade. When you look at movement of people, it's difficult for African to move from one continent to another, one country to another. It's much easier for European and Americans and people from Middle East to come to African countries than it is actually for African to do so. When you look at another area that are quite interesting, when you look at air travel, for instance, it is so restrictive and so many factors, free movement, trade, air travel, in which we don't welcome each other, but we are easily welcoming other peoples from other continents. And when we look at our development agenda, for most countries, it's not open to our fellow Africans, but it's actually open for other interests, and those interests, including loans and grants, always have their conditionalities and always have serve a specific interest to people that are actually giving it. So when you bring that conversation to space, of course, it's quite important to understand now that African continent actually realize the benefit of actually what the benefit that space sector can actually bring. I think we basically transpose the same challenges in terms of, for instance, when we look at the space agencies or space programs, which currently are 21, and they are growing at an alarming rate. With 18 of them having launched a satellite, and with 65 satellites. I'll share basically this deck to show, with all this data. And when you look at the benefits that have actually been documented on the benefit of space sector, for instance, there is a current investment of $7.7 billion on the continent, which is a paltry 1% of the global space sector. I mean, the Artemis 2 program, which we just witnessed, costed the US government around $100 billion US dollars. And therefore, such single program, one program alone, is actually dwarfing the entire continental investment. So this basically shows a lot of the state of things, including the low level of collaboration within the African continent, because you find that despite the fact that there are quite good benefits and the environment is actually, in terms of Africa being having a huge population, Africa being located on the equator, for instance, or having favorable circumstances that can actually foster the space sector. There's very little that is actually happening on the continent comparatively. And we look at the launches, even the launches that actually have happened, they are happening on foreign soils, as it were, and most of the focus from African mission is actually on the downstream, like Earth observation, connectivity, TV broadcast. And therefore, as you can see, there's a delayed entry into the space sector and exploration for the African continent, and that also largely is also contributed to so many factors like the colonial, the long periods of colonization, and also issues about economic development. And that also, the delayed aspect has also been, you find, as I mentioned, most of the programs on the continent are actually supported from Europe. Like in Kenya, we have a Kenya Space Agency that has very close ties, and a lot of programs have traditionally been supported by the Italian Space Agency, as it were. And we'll look at that has also led to a lot of fragmentation, because African continent, it being one of the second largest continent and quite a diverse continent. When we talk about this diversity, we're talking about economic diversity, political diversity, legal diversity that actually shaped a lot of how institutions are formed. And because of those diversities that actually arise from our colonial ties, that has actually shaped even our entry into our space laws and how our countries actually basically the models of governance in the space administration. And so look at some of the space agencies that have actually been established. There is fragmentation and quite different approaches. Like some are defense anchored, like Kenya Space Agency. Others are based on science and technology or driven, like the South African. Others are executive affiliated, like the Egyptian. And therefore, this leads to a lot of heterogeneous challenges, which makes it difficult to comply with some of the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, like Article 6. And therefore, because I mentioned now, space has been identified as a tool to propel us to 2063. There's been now a great effort from African Union to really try to coordinate, and this quite to try to coordinate the African continent. And this started in the year 2016 with the enactment of strategy of African space policy and strategy. We are now about to celebrate 10 years since the establishment of this particular strategy, and that led to a lot of conversations leading to 2019 and 2020, and ultimately last year in 2025, when the African Space Agency was inaugurated to coordinate and ensure the central coordination, unified voice, and also building indigenous space capabilities. Just allow me to finalize now with when you talk about because my book is actually titled Law and Policy, African Law and Policy, Space Law and Policy, Outer Space Pan-Africanism. So I've been able to, what basically my book does is that it fleshes out the goals under Agenda 2063 and attributes how the specific goals and how these goals can actually be attained, how each of these specific goals can actually be attained through the space sector, and fleshes out, gives documented studies in terms of even comparable Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, and how studies have actually shown how space sector can actually contribute to realization of the SDGs. But now my book now brings the focus to how can space sector help us in terms of realizing Agenda 2063 and contribute to the goals and the objectives that have actually been identified. And it's based on the African ideology being solidarity, collective self-reliance. And as I said, there's a lot of course, there's been a lot of space, there's growth in terms of space agencies on the continent, but most of it is actually derived or being supported from outside interest. For instance, I think it was last year where we saw one of the African countries, allow me not to mention it, that was supported by the Chinese. And the Chinese were threatening to disable their satellite because they did not meet a loan obligation. And therefore, that speaks to a lot of course, sovereignty. And, now we're talking about issues of data. We're talking that space is quite important to national security, data sovereignty. We're talking about now taking data centers to outer space, and now being, of course, now that our economies are dependent on cyber and all cyber security being supported by space technology, that speaks a lot of sovereignty issues, and this can actually show a lot of investment now within the renewed space race, particularly for private actors from the United States, China, and other countries. And therefore, I take a developing country approach, looking at how as African countries, we can actually develop our indigenous space technologies. And now how we can also, as African, be norm shapers, not just norm takers. Because when you look at the law in outer space and look at treaties in outer space that were enacted when Africa was actually struggling with other things in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Africa really did not contribute to a lot of discourse. And therefore, those laws and treaties like Outer Space Treaty really were informed by rivalries between the then USSR, currently Russia, and the United States. And they not appreciated a lot of the discussions for developing countries. And there's quite a lot of interest and a lot of activities now that space is becoming congested for the African countries. So we're looking at even the third world approaches to how Africa can actually be a norm shaper, but not just taking norms from other different countries. And then very lastly is that the book identified 6 core principles that describe now what will be a proper outer space approach for the African continent. And this is based on Pan-African solidarity, ensuring that space is actually, because one of the things about space sector is a very capital intensive industry. And and that's actually part of the reason why there's a lot of dependency. But now African countries can actually be able to come together within the ideology of Pan-Africanism to pull in their resources and to collaborate for ensure that there's this Pan-African solidarity. Then there's also peaceful and sustainable use, which is a major issue, in, particularly with now space and military, the dual use of space technology that has actually led to a lot of this discussion. So Africa needs to give a common voice in terms to ensure that space is continually becoming peaceful, or exactly used for peaceful purposes. And then there's equitable access of the benefits of space. And this is huge discussion. For instance, now concerning the key critical rare earth minerals that are actually found in the outer space, like the minerals on the moon. The moon has quite important minerals like the ice water, which is can actually be a game changer for energy, for energy solution. Then there's also technological self-determination, ensuring that there's also intergenerational stewardship, and lastly, ensuring that there is inclusive governance on space sector. And this brings all sectors together, including government, private sector, academia, youth, to ensure that international law, because currently I'm avoiding to go to a lot of things that are actually happening, and also in terms of the key gaps, because I think there's almost a global consensus that of that the normative framework or the legal framework that was established in 1960s, late 1960s and early 70s is not fit for purpose for the current space economy. So how do we contribute to that not make it, and how do we ensure that we are not being left aside behind, and that we are contributing to development so that we can actually harness space technology for our own development? I will rest at that.
Wow, thank you so much, Williams, for that brilliant presentation and just taking us through this journey from 19 or late 19th century down to the early 20th century and down to 1960, where we finally see a lot of the institutionalizing coming for the Organization of African Unity. And I think that history is very important, and I'm so pleased that you started with that and just telling us how we came to where we are now with the African Union and seeing the role that the African Union wants to take up and the African Space Agency. I do think I have some concerns, especially you've talked a lot about technological sovereignty, particularly you stressed on the need for self-determination. And maybe during the conversation period, we can maybe dive deep into some of the challenges and opportunities there, because it's an ideal. That's one thing about Pan-Africanism. It's an ideal, but the reality is a bit more complicated. So Thando, thank you so much for your patience, and I would like to hear your perspective on the topic before we go to the panel session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. William. It was a very detailed articulation. I think I really appreciate the links that you make, especially to how late we started because of colonialism. Basically, just as we started getting independence less than a decade later, that's when the foundational Outer Space Treaty was started, and that says a lot to sort of the gap that we're trying to cover now. But then also, I think something that is important is to also acknowledge that, space development in Africa started, quite almost at the same time as the Cold War race between the then Soviet Union and the United States. Seeing South Africa hosting some of the earliest ground stations, which were supporting some of the first Apollo missions, and that was something. And then when you look at Kenya, for example, they were already working with the Italians to do launch off the coast of Mombasa, and as soon as the late 1960s, early 1970s, you started to see Egypt, Nigeria starting to launch. And so we have a long history of space in Africa. But as was rightly articulated by Dr. William, the African Space Policy and Strategy of 2016 really sort of accelerated this development by creating a doctrine for states to follow. And it really helped states equally, those with capability and those without capability, to understand why we're going to space and the socioeconomic benefits that will come from there, which poses a question in and of itself, because the theory is developing space brings trickle-down development, so or spillover effects, if you want to call them that. And so for us to really realize these spillover effects, that is when we need our Pan-Africanism to show now. So we're saying, okay, Pan-Africanism has, of course, different elements, yeah? Not only looking at it from a superiority perspective, but looking at it from an equality perspective, saying I'm African and I'm at par with anyone else from another continent or race, if you want to make it about that as well. So, and then Pan-Africanism also talks about togetherness, as we rightfully now celebrate Africa Day, or as we now call it Africa Union Day. That just shows the togetherness that we're supposed to embrace. And in the space sector, collaboration is key. And as with all trade, intra-African trade is really lagging. I think at the moment, in general, we have less than 15% intra-African trade. And most of our trade is happening with trade partners outside Africa, and you can try to imagine the balance of the scales there. We have a situation where Africa is importing low cost or low value material, and it is importing high value or high cost material, and that is something we also observe in the space sector. So it speaks a lot to our sovereignty as well. But then, I mean, it's been 10 years of the African space policy and strategy. And I mean, I have to plug the Africa Space Leadership Institute, who they're hosting a colloquium towards the end of the year. And the theme is taking stock of the African space policy and strategy after 10 years. So, I'm quite happy we are also having this webinar on Pan-Africanism today, because, I mean, 10 years have already passed, because it was January 2016. And, you know, a lot of the development has already been alluded to by Dr. William, but then a lot of questions still remain, because a lot of these developments in space have happened, you know, with cooperation with our friends from the East, the West, and Europe. So now the question there is, how equitable are these cooperation agreements? And there's really a need there for Africa to try and cement itself, try to move from deal making, try to move to deal making rather than looking at it from an aid conditioned partnerships, where you know, these partnerships look like Africa is receiving help. So there's really you know, a need to focus more on product ownership, investing in IP during these partnerships, because when you look at most of how they are structured, you find that there's a lot of African data that is used, images which observe Africa. And this data is used to train AIs, it's used to develop platforms, used to develop systems. And then when it's time to use these systems outside of these aid conditioned environments, you have to pay a lot of money. And so while we are contributing or co-creating these platforms together, the benefits are then coming off, you know, a little bit askew. So that is something, you know, that we need to look at when we're considering Pan-Africanism as well. I also want to talk about norm entrepreneurship when it comes to the governance of outer space. I'll focus specifically on space security, because that is what I'm currently working on. I think, you know, you have various multilateral processes where space security is discussed. So I'm just going to switch devices here, because it seems like I'm having challenges with my connection here. But then when you look at this, you know, space security discussions, you realize that at the conference on disarmament, it focuses mostly on disarmament, but then there is an issue which is called PAROS, the prevention of an armed race in outer space. And you see, the contribution of African states in that process is quite limited. You do have some African states that really contribute, and then you also have states that contribute under the Arab group or the African group or the non-aligned movement. But then those contributions or those statements that are made, they're quite generic and quite bland. They don't really reflect the actual priorities that Africa is trying to push. And I'll give you a shameless plug here. You can find, if you look at the United Nations Institute of Disarmament Research and find what we call the Space Security Portal, which is a project that I've been contributing to, and most of my contributions have been on African states. We really try to profile how African states have contributed to the conversation on space security and how they are handling that. So there's really need there for African states to push for norms that really prioritize
I think we lost Thando, but he did mention that he was having some internet concerns. Yeah, I'll just fill in until he comes. But in the meantime, if anybody has any question, any comments, please could you, okay, I see a comment on the chat. Letita wants to know what is the title of Dr. William's book. Dr. William, please, the title of your book, and maybe if you have a link or anything to for someone to be able to get the book, if you could share that later with us, that would be great as well. Yes, so we are happy to take any other question. Yvette, yes, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for convening this meeting. I'm finding the conversations very thought-provoking. I'd like to know, before I start, is there anyone from industry actually represented on your panel?
Thando works across Thando, he has experience in industry. He's done a little bit of both. Currently,
Okay.
I think for the past maybe 7 or 8 months, he's been with the UN, but before then he was in industry. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's great to know. Dr. Williams, well, as a way of introduction, I'm the CEO and co-founder of two companies in Cape Town, South Africa, right? So I'm at the grassroots level of manufacturing and incubating small startups in the space sector. So I find this conversation very interesting, but I want to bring a different perspective because obviously what is important is our Pan-African vision, and definitely as an industry leader, Pan-Africanism is very close to my heart. But I think the conversation that is lacking is the parts that Africa is actually doing well. I like all the conversation. I like the fact that we must have an integrated voice. I like the view that it's the United States of Africa. Yes, there are problems. There is a fragmented approach to ecosystem building, but I think Africa can position itself in the next 10 years as a global leader. The only thing lacking from what I'm hearing is our identity. We are actually participating in the global space market. One company in South Africa has got 100, let me rather give you the percentage of all the satellites in orbit. They've got space components on 20% of all the satellites. Okay. There are manufacturing companies in the upstream and the downstream. So I think, yes, we need to discuss the problems that we're having from collaborating together, but we need to remember who we are. And I think that's a very big part of anybody's identity. And individually and in raising children, we need to know who we are. We need to know we can compete and we are competing. And the conversation should be about how do we do it better? How can the countries come together and talk about making what we have stronger? Space agencies on the African continent are talking about increasing their industrial capacity and investing heavily on human capital development. So thank you very much. I'm just being devil's advocate here.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Yvette. It's always good to always look at the bright side and sort of like see our strengths and our potential and see especially what is happening from the industry point of view. I think 2 months ago we hosted a dialogue on the South African space ecosystem where we had some representatives from, Cube Space and I think from Sansa as well, and
Yeah.
SKA as well, and some of the people working, in the South African space ecosystem. And we did have some of the sort of like industry perspectives, especially as to what the continent is doing, especially what South Africa is bringing to the conversation. So before I go to Dr. Williams, just to respond from my own point of view, I think one of the challenges that we're seeing here, especially when we're talking from a public sector, because when we talk about Pan-Africanism and we celebrate in Africa Day, we are particularly looking at the institutions our public institutions, which are meant to then drive what's happening in academia and the industry and etc. And especially when you look from that perspective in terms of what these institutions are supposed to be doing in terms of the African Union and some of the public space agencies, then there is a lot to critique there, and there is a lot to talk again about antecedent conditions like colonialism and everything. There's no how we can have this conversation without talking about those sort of negative. It's part of the history. It's all very convoluted, especially when you look at the sort of weak institutions that we certainly have in the continent at the moment. So I think maybe that's where a bit of the negative side of the conversation comes in from my perspective. So yeah, Dr. Williams, I don't know if you want to add something to that. Yeah.
I totally agree with you, and I think and thank you so much for that question and intervention, because it helped me reflect. And I usually have most of these sessions actually at the University of Cape Town, and I'm weary at starting from a very negative perspective, because that's
Politics.
like, yeah,
It's always grim. It's always grim.
it's always, and
It's
every
always
time,
grim.
yeah, every time I get an opportunity, I say, yeah, let's stop, and it's good to give the figures. And most of this, we are not very good in keeping our data. Of course, increasingly countries actually put in uneven studies and all that. So I'm actually always looking at trying to, and part of my storytelling about the African continent is to tell the good side, because nobody is actually telling really the good side in terms of what is actually happening. When people think about the African continent, they are thinking about donation, or there's also a lot of misinformation and disinformation about the African continent. So there's a lot. Africa is indeed rising in the space sector. We've seen a lot of like Kenya. Kenya is actually in the process of actually establishing its space port, and a lot of space economy is actually, a lot of indigenous activities are actually happening throughout the African continent, which is hopefully going to inspire that economic growth to the African continent. But of course, all that cannot be devolved from the conversation about history and economy. Space is not happening, or space development is not happening in a void. It's happening within the context of other economic challenges. It's happening within the context of, Thando talked about technology and IP concerns, a huge discussion. It's happening within the context of trade. We cannot dissociate it from a broader concept. So, and even as we, like myself in the academia, I'm usually very careful to prescribe, because there's no one single approach to how actually we can actually solve such issues. But of course, we really must appreciate, and also that actually becomes very careful, because part of my book, what I do is a comparative analysis, and part of it is to be able to look at what is happening in Europe, but most importantly, what is actually happening within the developing countries' perspective, and even warning in terms of transplanting some of the concepts, because they are not applicable within African. We don't have the same funding needs. Our needs, basically, most of the African countries are still struggling with poverty, education, health systems, and all that. So part of what we really want to do is to really shape the mindset that this space technology can actually be a game changer when it comes to all these industries.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for the intervention as well. Thank you, Yvette, for just pointing us in that direction and just helping us, see the context, different contexts that we can approach this conversation. That was such a good intervention. Thank you, Yvette. Samantha, before you ask your question, please keep your hands on. I think Thando is back on the call. I think he was about to wrap up, and then we can go full blown discussing. So Thando, I don't know if you want to wrap up.
Hi everyone. I am back. I apologize for that disruption.
We understand.
A funny story actually that I want to tell you is, so I live in a low income community, you can call it, I don't know, a high density suburb, and so we now have closer to to our cluster of small tuck shops, I've seen that 3 of those tuck shops actually have external Starlink routers. Yeah, so that's something, that's just something, you know, to take note of. It's very interesting. So you go there and you pay $1 and you get access for 1 to 2 days, you know, unlimited internet from space. So I think it's a good point to
Brilliant.
also then, yeah, it's a good point to you know, include in our discussion there, that um while we appreciate you know, the positives, like this development is a positive development, and all the positive developments that have been highlighted by Yvette, and I mean, South Africa is actually a model of what a space business ecosystem should look like in Africa, because a lot of components are being exported from South Africa. I remember on one of the ride-share missions being done by SpaceX, I remember South Africa had supplied 60 to 70% of the components for that ride-share mission, and it was a moment to be proud of. So back again on this Starlink issue, and tying it back to my conversation on space security. We also need to be cognizant of, in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, protecting our own industries, in as much as you know, our cooperating counterparts protect their own industries. The development of Starlink in Africa, and I'm glad Space in Africa is actually doing a survey on this, and I hope they're going to make a very interesting analytical report on it. Starlink has been used as a tool to mingle with the geopolitics of Africa. We have seen this in South Africa, we have seen this in the Congo and DRC, where first these countries refuse, even my country as well, Zimbabwe, I think. First, they refuse and say, no, there is no need for you to bring your services here. If you're going to bring them here, comply with our local laws. For South Africa, for example, it was the EBBE. I'm not. I'm sure I'm butchering that, but it should be the Black Economic Empowerment Act or something, which provides for some form of, you know, minority shareholdership or ownership by Black Africans, and and Starlink was used to strong arm the South African government into almost buckling on that law. I'm glad they managed to push back. So that's an example of African agency right there. And in the Congo, unfortunately, they buckled. And in many other states where they had initially refused, they had buckled because of the security concerns that Starlink comes with. Starlink is inadvertently also linked with the Department of Justice, or the Department of War, as they call it now. So that's something that we also need to be cognizant of in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, as well as recognizing how space impacts security. And then another interesting development that we saw recently was with multi-choice. If you have, especially in Southern Africa, if you have enjoyed watching DSTV, watching Showmax, you know those services were brought to us by multi-choice. And most recently, multi-choice was sold to Canal, or Canal Plus, I don't know the proper name, which is a French company. So now that's space-based. That's a space-based service, yeah, because it's satellite TV and satellite internet streaming on those platforms like Showmax. But in 2026, you have Africa at a point where we cannot even provide entertainment to ourselves from space. That is something which is unacceptable, given we started developing this in the 1970s. And up to now in 2026, we're saying we cannot support ourselves, to the point that we have to sell to the to French entrepreneurs who are now supporting us with our own content, which is on multi-choice. So while that might not seem like an apparent space security issue, there are signs and indicators that soon we'll begin you know, to see. And then just allow me to end on you know, the issue of skills. In 2023, I attended the IAC, the International Astronautical Congress, and on one of the panels, they were reporting on GLOC, which is the Global Conference on Climate Change, which is also run by the IAC. And one of the panelists, a very respected and high-level member of the Earth observation community, he's European, he made a comment and said,
African states or African actors are not aware and lack the capabilities to do a lot of the data processing for climate change from space. And I found that offensive. I had a couple of Pan-Africans, quote unquote, who I was sitting with. And, we took offense. But then we realized that we're actually getting angry at the wrong thing. So in terms of capacity, in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, what the space sector needs to do is also to realign, to redirect, and to optimize the skills that we have locally to tackle some of the pressing challenges that we already have. For example, while we might be coined as, Africa lacks agency in space security and in space governance, you find that we have a lot of expertise in disarmament, which might not directly include space, but it is easy to redirect that talent to say, you see this disarmament that we're working on in terms of terrestrial security issues, they also apply to space. So how can you contribute to this conversation? And that's easy. So we already have a lot of international security experts, international politics, relations, and so forth. We already have those experts. So we also have a lot of expertise in space policy that's burgeoning, and I'm sure it's growing. So the next time you hear someone talking about capacity building in Africa, you need to quickly shut them down and tell them that, no, Africa has capacity. We don't need to build any more capacity. We just need to realign it or to re-strategize it. A simile that I usually use is Africa has all the chess pieces in its hands. We just need to rearrange the chess pieces to make a winning game. So allow me to end at that, and allow me to apologize again for the intermittent transmission that I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Thando. Thank you for your talk and just bringing some of those important points, especially regards to satellite communication. And yes, Starlink is an issue, but quite interesting. You brought up the issue of African agency in the pushback from South Africa, and it's really sort of goes to show how geopolitics and space, goes really hand in hand as well. And it's very important that we recognize the dimension, of how the space sector actually works in that way. So thank you very much, Thando. I don't know if we have any questions from the chat. So that Samantha, you wanted to ask a question before I go, because I have a few things I want to talk about as well. So Samantha, I just have to call you to ask a question.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone who has presented so far. My question is directed to Dr. William. I like the statistics that you mentioned starting the presentation. And it looks like, well, yeah, I think we are doing well. Since we are marking 10 years from this.
Samantha, I don't know if it's just from my end, but I can't hear you quite clearly. Dr. Williams, do you hear her quite clearly? I think there's some of echo.
Yeah, there is some echo, but I'm
Oh,
fine.
my network is very bad.
Can you text your question?
Can you
text?
hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but there's a lot of feedback. If you don't mind, could you just send your question as a text, and we'll definitely get to it. Definitely get to it. Thank you. Thanks for your understanding. So while we wait for that, I just wanted to circle back on Pan-Africanism and the African Union and Dr. William. Of course, this is very biased considering I'm doing research on it, but I just wanted to know your thoughts around the sort of regionalism that we've done in Africa so far. Because when we talk about Pan-Africanism and African countries working together for the benefit of the continent, there's a huge part of Pan-Africanism which is about running these programs by ourselves, for ourselves, that sort of by Africans, for Africans, with African sort of initiative. But what we've seen so far at the policy and at the academic levels, in the literature, in the statistics, in the reports by the African Union, the vector of African regionalism is hinged on Africa-EU relations. So we have a lot of the regional projects in Africa being projects that are externally supported from the European Union or from other partners, across the West as well. And just thinking about what sort of implications you see this for space, or how can we make this work, because it's almost seemingly the same thing, right? So we do have a regional space program, but how much of that regional space program is being forwarded, promoted, excitedly supported by different African countries is also another conversation to have. Of course, we do have some regional collaborations here and there, especially sub-regionally, but to see one big regional program, at the continent level is a bit of a challenge. What do you think about these sort of dynamics? How can we go about it, or your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that interesting question. And it's a question I've been having a discussion I've been having with all my friends, of course, who has been championing for regional economic communities and all that.
That's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, so but it's very interesting. I was gonna say there's no a single silver bullet. All those approaches have their own advantages and disadvantages, but just tackling it from the very top of this cooperation or sometimes collaborations, and we can borrow that from a lot of experiences in trade, in intellectual property. Like in intellectual property, we have all these commitments that are tied to cooperation. I mean, and it's quite, and I think somebody Thando has actually
Yeah, Thando's
yeah,
listed them out for us.
yeah, some of the very good initiative. Actually, one that was a cooperation between Kenya, South Africa, and Uganda
Yeah.
for climate change and all that. But it's quite unfortunate, and from different circles, there are people who are all in suspicion anything that is collaborative, but that has actually happened in terms of collaboration. Look at institutions like WTO and the issues of trade, and how such international institutions, even international law itself, has actually been shaped by these discourses about major institutions like World Bank, IMF. There's always a suspicion that there's an agenda which is actually driven from other side, because why would somebody support you? They're also looking for the
Yeah.
interest of their countries, like
Yeah,
market
that's
access.
quite interesting. But doesn't that take us back to the 1960s when Nkrumah had
Yes,
a vision and everybody was suspicious of Nkrumah? It's like a circle.
yes, yes. So it's a vicious cycle. It's really a vicious cycle. And one of the things that I'm really wary about Africa, we are very good in signing documents and instrument. And sometimes I attend these conferences both in air and space law. And when you meet the same representatives of government. And when you meet them on the floor, I mean, these are the people who are either advising, because you're meeting the ministers, you're meeting people, director generals on space agencies, and they're very uh, uh, positive in terms of what we should do as an African continent. But over 50 years, we still do the same issues because of the problem of dependency, because the collaborations that we enter into, uh, historically, they have not been on an equal partnership. They're actually tied to either, because when look at even those launches that are actually happening on the African continent, it is trying to leverage on the natural endowment that the African continent has. For instance, when you look at the huge landmass, when you look at the clear skies, when you look at the position on the equator that actually can actually support those launches, and when they found others alternative uh, places, they go and forget about the African continent, because found that most of the launches that actually happened in 60s, when they found other interesting places to do the launches, they migrated to all those. And that's why when you talk about now collaboration, we, of course, it's good. And part of it problematizing the very continental top-down approach is that, first of all, it's good to understand how integration leave space, regional
Okay.
integration, no making, and collaboration and economics and politics of the African continent. It's good to understand that environment because ultimately it's the same institutions and presidents and all that lawmaking. So it's good to understand that Africa is a huge continent that has quite a huge amount of diversities. Those diversities shape a lot of factors. Countries don't just collaborate in space sectors. They are collaborating in so many other sectors, which those sectors have actually been shaped by different ideologies over a long period of time. And the history that we touched on about economic development and regional integration in Africa, regional economic groupings actually came in to fill a lot of that gaps, particularly in with a lot of focus in 1960s and 70s being on political. And ultimately, when the colonizers had left, they left with a lot of issues of resources, a lot of structures that are actually there were actually geared towards exporting. For instance, when we look at the road system, the air transport system, the shipping system, has informed a lot of that discussion in terms of trade, because all those trade routes, air routes, and technology transfer is actually being, Africa is made to receive, to export, what Thando said, to export cheap raw materials. And that cheap raw material is made, is actually made in a way that the infrastructure is basically made in a way that we will not be able as Africans to come together to really go to the table to negotiate. And I think this is actually a very great initiative of the African Space Agency to actually ensure that there's just one voice. Because one of the major problems is that you find like a country, let me use an example of the East African community. We are about 7 countries within the East African community. We have a common custom union. Ideally, we're supposed to be going to the table to negotiate as one entity. But you find that there's always a divide and conquer with all these other. You find that our own former colonial masters, with their strong economies, you look at a country, small country like Belgium in size. Belgium is very tiny country in terms of size. But when you look at the economy of Belgium, is bigger than actually the cumulative economy of the countries within the East African community. But still, Belgium does not go to the table in multilateral fora to speak to for itself. It goes now through, and that's exactly what the European Union realized, that for us to be able to compete with a huge
with the US
US, or for us to be able to compete with Japan, we really need to really coalesce and come together. And I think that's something that we are still, as Africa, we're still tied, we still fancy a lot the concept of sovereignty. So we are, I think it's because we just got it. We are so excited about it, 50, 60 years. So we're still a bit excited about that. And that sovereignty, we can all, it's very easy for Kenya to compromise its sovereignty when having discussions. We have a very interesting discussion now with Ebola and all that in the country right now, because the US wants to set up a center for US citizens so that they can actually be segregated and issues of Ebola rising on on Kenya. And Mark Rubio is actually on the record saying that we are protecting the US interest. And then the Kenyan government is actually saying that, yes, come and set this. So we are easily compromised because of so many other
so many other factors.
So many economic factors, because of course we want, of course, that is coming with money. It's coming with other issues, maybe market access and all that. We will never be, as long as we are going as Kenya to negotiate with the European Union. Imagine Kenya alone or Rwanda going to negotiate
you have to come together as one.
So that coalition, and there are many interests that actually, and this is very controversial, there are many interests that always ensure that those countries never come together in terms of common voice.
Both external and internal interests, actually.
There's both external and internal interests.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of literature showing, the European Union also sometimes wanting to work together as a bloc, but at the same time, there's a lot of controversies within the
Yes.
countries themselves,
There's a
also
lot of
sort of
interest, yeah.
facilitated by the EU and by
Yes.
African
But
countries themselves,
yeah, so
back and forth.
narrowing down to, because this conversation, even including space, is actually tied to each broader concept of technology, of technology transfer, which is tied to IP and international trade and investment. So there is, when we look at the entire system, for instance, the WTO system is not, is usually shaped in a manner where it is not the majority that speaks. It's actually due to the economic powers. And when all
Wow.
those is
Yeah,
actually tied to it,
together.
countries will always be, for instance, let me finalize with this example. Like Kenya and Uganda and Ethiopia, we produce coffee, but we still have a fragmented approach of exporting our own coffee. So, and our markets, because we don't make value addition, and no value addition is actually tied to economy. Actually, when you look at my book, the first chapter really does the economic setting and to try to understand what is the economy, the political economy of African continent in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of even climate change, and all this, and how that conversation actually dovetails to the broader conversation now about trade when it comes to space technology and market access and all that. So, as finally, for us to really be able to have a common voice, regardless as whether that common voice will likely happen within very good initiatives, or whether, for instance, African community should have its own agenda, because those regional economic communities have been, some of them have actually been at the very, they have been very instrumental in promoting some of the discussion, because they are more of coalitions of the willing countries. But also there's the downside of it, what that leads to what one scholar called Jagdish Bhagwati calls the spaghetti effect, or the spaghetti ball, where there's a lot of commitments that countries take. For instance, Kenya is, let me use Tanzania. Tanzania is part of the East African community. Tanzania is part of SADC. Tanzania is also part of, I'm not sure whether they're part of COMESA. So
Africa
all
has
that,
the highest level of
yes.
economic communities in
So
the
all that
world.
leads to a lot of sometimes commitments that are not aligned, and a lot of because all these initiatives require a lot of resources. So
Yeah.
there is actually lots of prioritization in terms of the resources to be directed, and that
Yeah.
fragmentation works now for foreign interest.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really interesting to see how space exists within sort of social, political, socio-economic setting in Africa. And no matter how much we try to make space look very elitist, very different, it's all part of the system. And I just want to quickly come back to a question here by Samantha. Samantha is asking, I think this question was for you, Dr. Williams. If we meet in 20, I don't know what she means by we, but if we meet in 2036, what key milestones would indicate that Africa has become a significant player in the global space industry? Should Africa measure success by the number of satellite launches or by the economic value created from space-derived services? Oh yeah, I think I get the question. Yeah. So how do we see that Africa is a significant player by 2036 by satellite or economic value? So
Yeah, so I believe she meant 2063, which is now the
yeah, I
ultimate.
don't,
Yeah,
I don't know. Maybe she didn't
yeah.
mean
So
2036.
yeah, but as we mentioned, Africa is a late comer, but it's moving at a rapid speed. And also that is actually facilitated by a lot of interest. I think I'm just looking at some of the participants. There's people who have interacted with doing what amazing stuff on the African continent in terms of the technology, and also really bringing awareness into space technology. And therefore, the success of the continent will not just be on the number of launches, satellite launches, but how to be able basically to see how far have we been able to link space technology. First of all, when we talk about the civil use of space technology, we are talking about, because we really must have go back to the conversation about sustainable development goals, because we want to have a better world. and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, how is, and quite good studies that have actually been done by UN agencies. So how are we linking that to Sustainable Development Goal? But specifically now, dovetailing that conversation to the African continent, this goes, the Agenda 2063 is actually informed by a lot of self-introspection. And therefore, those, in terms of contribution, and there are quite a number of studies as well, apart from my book as well, which have actually shown how each of these aspects of the goals that we have actually put for ourselves under Agenda 2060 can actually be attained. So our success will be an entire spectrum of looking at each of the specific goals and how space has actually contributed to issues of climate change, issues to job creation on the continent, issues to peace. Thando, that is actually in issues to do with even issues to do with planetary defense, because and even
everything, the whole
and a lot of because exploration also, space exploration, by the way, is not just sending satellites to space or sending people to do explorations. The earliest form of explorations were actually done in Africa, in Egypt, through observation. There's a lot of communities in Africa and elsewhere have a close connection to planetary terrestrial objects. And they are exactly part of they inform the moon and star, inform a lot of patterns like agriculture and all that. So it is quite important to even now shape that key conversation.
That part as well.
That part of the conversation, and that will actually be really informed by coming together to support each other, and even to give. There are also very, very many aspects, because, for instance, look at the Moon Agreement, which is actually more of a failed agreement because we could not agree, or the international community could not actually agree on resource allocation. But do you know, Africa, for instance, has always been a thought leader and maintained communal system over a very long period of time on how communal economic system can actually be shaped. Maybe it's time for the West, because the West has always leaned toward capitalism. And now the biggest problem of space law and the economy is actually about capitalism, as in terms of I'm the one who's gotten these resources. How do I make SpaceX and all that is issues about an economic model. But Africa has actually been a thought leader in communal use, and that has actually worked for the continent. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. William. Sorry, I was almost going to cause you, but thank you for answering that question. Absolutely, Samantha. Like he said, it's not just about launching satellite. We have to look at the whole spectrum, upstream, downstream, and then of course peg that to our policies like the SGDs or Agenda 2063. So thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And Thando, I'm just going to get back to you. And if you want to give us your final words, I see we are sort of running a little bit out of time. We still have maybe one or two announcements to give from our end before we wrap up the conversation today. But I just wanted to hear from you, Thando. And does anybody have any question? Final call for questions. If you have any questions, any concerns, please send your questions to the chats box. And then yes, Thando. I don't think Thando is
Okay, thank you.
yes, Thando.
Yeah,
thank you,
Nelly.
coming back.
Yeah, thank you very much. While we wait for any final questions, I think I really enjoyed this conversation with Dr. William and with yourself, and I really enjoyed the questions from the audience as well. Really engaged. I think my final thoughts will always lean towards collaboration. I think we really underestimate the amount of money that is needed to be equitable players in the space industry. This whole idea of African states individually launching small satellites and doing all sorts of missions, which there's another conversation on where is this data with the 69, almost 70 objects that we have launched. We do not have a centralized platform where we can access the data on Africa created by African satellites. And when you look at the
But perhaps
European
it's because
sector,
we don't have access to the data, Thando. Well,
I mean that's
conversation
something, you
for
know,
another.
we yeah, that's something
Hey,
we might want to
maybe that's something we might want
to
to talk.
investigate as well. because now you know, we have African data coming from the Europeans, the Chinese, the Indians, and we have it in the United States, and we have it for free. But then I saw one of the African space agencies, I won't mention their name in the
Please
spirit of
do.
Pan-Africanism,
Here
but
we call
one of the
name.
African space agencies, you know, made a whole post online, you know, talking about, oh, if you want to access data from our National Space Agency, you have to write a letter and tell us the purpose of the data, and then you submit the letter to us, and then we will approve your request. I'm like, do you know that this data is actually available for free? I don't even know why you want me to write a letter for me to get 10-meter resolution data. But anyway, I mean, it all goes back to this whole idea of, you want to practice protectionism against your own brothers and sisters, but you do not want to practice it when it comes to partnering with foreign actors. And again, it ties back to my ever omnipotent point of, we are not doing enough to collaborate within Africa. We are not doing enough to support the local African space market. The South African companies that we are all proud of, they are selling to and
Europeans.
in collaboration with the European market, the Western market. And we have African, you know, launches that are reliant on those European states as well. So a component sometimes moves from South Africa to Europe, and then to Europe back to Africa, which is, I don't know, no comment. So that will be my final word. Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you, Thando Mathe. That was a very, very provoking close. Yeah, and I think we'll have the final words from Dr. Williams, because there's a question here, and maybe Dr. Williams, you want to just answer this question and also give us sort of like your parting words as well. So Yvette is asking how industry can encourage the African Space Agency leaders to work together rather than in silos. Okay, this is quite poignant, especially looking at what Thando just said. Said we have African companies who build satellites and constellations. The question is, why does African leaders rather trust foreign companies to provide the same service for more than double the price? Exactly what Thando was just saying. So this is spot on. So I think you just have to probably comment on, the last conversation, right, Thando?
Yeah, so thank you, sir, for that good question, Yvette. And it's true. And again, when going back to role of governments and private sector, I think history has taught us that governments alone, and because governments will always have a lot of interest and be twisted at times, even to sacrifice the interest of the private sector. And private sector in this sense, I include industry. So industry is actually should be at the forefront in terms of shaping this, or even making the case of the benefits. Because once governments are able to see the benefits that actually come in, and the economic benefits and social political government benefits that actually arising from the countries, then they will be able to support. Because, or even not just that way, we've seen a lot of lobbying by industry and private sector to shape government policy. So I think for the biggest part, and now because private sector is now the biggest player, not government, private sector, where the likes of what is happening in the US, Elon Musk, Starlink, and all that. Private sector is now the major investments, and therefore by first of all pulling the investment within the continent, which unfortunately is not as the continent may not be able to mobilize a lot within itself, a lot of capital, because of we don't have a solid capital markets for that. But industries can always players within the continent or African countries can actually get into financial support, or not just support, but also leveraging on, within the multilateral framework that exists, to actually show that case, because we can't leave. And I think speaking as a Kenyan, there's a lot of mistrust from the citizens and the industry to the government, because of course a lot of people in the government can always be twisted to serve other objectives or purposes. And therefore, when we have a strong industry, then it's number one, makes a good case for economy. Number two, it acts as a lobby for governments in those key platforms. Then my parting shot will be, I think we need to see a lot of people, because space sector is, or the space economy is a very broad area that requires quite multidisciplinary. I've met, I was actually in a conference in Leiden with some of the participants here, and they can tell you, when you look at the topics submitted and people talking about, a lot of different people, lawyers, it's not just a piece up for engineers or policymakers. It's basically for everybody. And therefore, my parting shot will be for us to really come into this space, because when I have attended events and conferences on space, I meet people now from other continents and who have been in this sector since the 70s when they were young. And now they have actually significantly invested their time and resources. And one of the biggest things that we want to really contribute is actually capacity development on the African continent, and more people who are actually in this particular sector, so that when you are telling people you're researching, because when I tell people that I research on space law, you still get that look that what is that and how does it affect me? But when we have more and more people getting to really get into the practice opportunities, because when the sector grows, we need lawyers, we need economics, we need engineers who really be, and so many other sectors that I may not exhaustively give, who would actually need to give that multidisciplinary approach. And it's a sector that is actually much welcoming and a lot of collaboration, particularly on the African continent. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. Absolutely, I know that look, because I research on space politics, space international relations these days, but I have a space law background, and usually people are like, especially in Africa. So what do you do? How do you get paid? But I think it's very important, and I'm happy you really stressed that space is for everybody. And I want to thank everybody once again for joining our webinar series and for joining us today. Before we close out for the day, I'm just going to share my screen again. And I'm going to call my colleague Timothy, if he just wants to say one or two words about what we built to make sure that space is accessible for everybody in Africa. And Timothy, if you want to go, please. I want to believe, yes, he's on the call.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's been a very wonderful session. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. I'm very happy to be here, and special thanks to Thando and Mr. Williams for the wonderful conversation. Well, before we wrap up, I'm just very quickly going to point you guys to what we did, what we've been working on in Spacehubs Africa for some months now. We came up with a database that comprises infrastructure. I don't know, Nelly. Okay, you're sharing it, right?
Okay. I want to share this. Yes. I'm sending it on the chat so that everybody can access it. Yeah, that's what I wanted.
Okay, all right. With the rising Africa space economy, the problem or the issue we have is information and access to information. So that's what this African space database is to address, that challenge of getting information, access to information about the African space database. So what you find there, it's a centralized repository of Africa's space ecosystem. It is designed to capture and organize key space assets and stakeholders across the continent. It provides structured information, searchable and comparable information, that supports researchers, policymakers, and students, as well as industry professionals. What do you find on the database? You find national space agencies and government institutions. You find research and development centers. You find academic institutions, laboratories, and university space programs. You also find satellites developed, owned, or operated by African nations. You find ground stations and tracking facilities. You find private space companies and startups. We find space associations, clubs, professional organizations, as well as international collaborations and partnerships pertaining to the space sector currently in the continent. The beauty of it is that you don't have to pay in order to get access to every information on the database. You have various tiers. We have a tier where you can just view the database, get access to information, and then we have the one where you have to be a registered member, and you can register with email and have access to deeper information. And then we have an analytics dashboard that is exclusive to just premium subscribers. If you do that, you have access to an analytics dashboard where you get to see analysis carried out across the various maybe satellite launch startups within this particular region across the continent. So there's just a lot. So I encourage you to subscribe. I also encourage you to register and be a part of the platform. You can have access to it at data.spacehubs.africa.
I've sent it.
You've sent it. All right.
Yes,
Thank you very much, Nelly.
Okay.
Data.spacehubs.africa. And then you can check it out. It can be a part of what we are doing. There's still a lot to go. Okay, we are still improving the platform. We are still getting more information on board.
And feedback.
And we're also still, we also need feedback from our members. We need to know what you want to see on the platform. What do you think should be on it? What do you need? What you don't need? Because we are very community oriented. I'm trying to make sure that our members feel they are part of what we are doing, and also trying the best we can to improve it to fit. Whether you're a researcher, whether you're a student, you're an investor, whatever you're doing, we just want you to be a part of what you're doing at Spacehubs Africa. So thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. Timothy's been working very hard for the past few months with our managing director and other members of the team working on the database. So I would really like to encourage everybody to look at the database, especially just tell us what you think about it and give us your feedback. It's very helpful. A lot of the conversations we've mentioned here, we've talked about companies in South Africa, we've talked about collaboration, we've talked about partnerships. If you're new to the space industry, especially, and you're not very familiar with what is going on, I think that's a very good place, for you to start as well. And that is a wrap from my end. I want to say a very big thank you to everybody. We've been running this dialogue series for a while now, and it's really my pleasure to have been your host. And yes, I'm hoping maybe some other time in the future, you would always see me in around anything that has to do with space and Africa. You will definitely see me. So this is not goodbye forever, just goodbye for now. And I would really like to encourage us for our group photo if you want to take a photo with us. And I think this group photo has to be the best group photo for the dialogue series because it might possibly be the last. So yes, you can just put on your camera and let's have a group photo before we close the group chat. Zoom call. Sorry, everybody. I'll start recording now. Just a second. Okay.